It was the perfect day for a hike. The kind of day that makes you feel like you were meant to be outdoors, where the sky is that perfect shade of blue and the sun bathes everything in a warm, golden light. I had been looking forward to this hike for weeks, and now that I was here, everything felt right. The trail stretched ahead of me, winding through a dense forest that was only just beginning to show the colors of fall. The air was crisp but not cold, and the light breeze rustled the leaves gently overhead. I'd hiked this trail before many times, in fact. It was well-known, well-traveled, and had become a kind of sanctuary for me over the years. The path was clear, wide enough for a few people to walk side by side, and the dense trees around it provided a peaceful, almost meditative atmosphere. I liked to come here when life felt overwhelming, when I needed to clear my head and get away from the noise of the world. The first few miles were just as I remembered. Quiet, serene, the occasional bird call breaking the silence. I had my music off, just enjoying the sound of my footsteps crunching on the dirt path, the occasional creak of the trees, and the rustling of animals in the brush. I wasn't in a rush. I wanted to take my time, enjoy the hike, and let my mind wander. It was somewhere around 3 miles in when I first noticed the footsteps. They weren't particularly loud, but they were there. Soft, measured steps behind me, just barely audible above the sounds of the forest. At first, I figured it was just someone else on the trail, maybe someone a little slower than me walking at a similar pace. But as I glanced behind me, I saw nothing. No one was there. The trail was empty. I slowed my pace for a moment, listening carefully, but the footsteps had stopped as well. I told myself it was nothing. It was probably just the wind or the echo of my own steps bouncing off the trees. I resumed my hike, picking up my pace again, trying to shake the strange feeling that had begun to creep into my mind. But the footsteps didn't stop. They resumed almost immediately, right behind me, and this time they were a little clearer, a little more distinct. The sound was like someone following in perfect time with my own steps, mirroring my every movement. I stopped again, dead in my tracks, trying to catch a glimpse of whoever it might be, but there was no one. My heart began to beat a little faster now. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't explain it, but something didn't feel right. I glanced over my shoulder again, hoping to spot a hiker or maybe a trail runner, but nothing. The path behind me was as empty as it had been before. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was just overthinking things. I wasn't exactly alone on this trail. There were other hikers, and I knew I wasn't too far from a popular spot where people often stopped to rest. I tried to remind myself that the sound of footsteps was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then it happened again. Step, step, a perfect echo of my own. It was too perfect, too deliberate. Every time my foot hit the ground, there was a corresponding sound behind me. It wasn't random. It was too in sync, almost as if whoever it was following me was paying very close attention, mirroring my every movement without a single misstep. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I started walking again, picking up the pace, hoping I could shake whatever this was off. But the footsteps followed me. I began to speed up, walking faster and then jogging. The footsteps picked up with me, keeping in perfect rhythm. I started to panic. This wasn't normal. Whoever was behind me was mimicking my every move, and they were doing it with unnerving precision. I broke into a full run, heart pounding in my chest now. The footsteps followed, just as fast, just as perfectly synchronized with my own. I didn't dare look back anymore, not wanting to see what was there, but I could feel the presence of something or someone behind me, matching my every move, staying just out of sight. The faster I ran, the harder my breath came, but the footsteps kept pace with me, never breaking rhythm, never faltering. The trail stretched out ahead, and I ran as fast as I could, my muscles burning with the exertion. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Who was following me? Why didn't they show themselves? Why were they copying my every step? I didn't stop until I reached the end of the trail. I was breathless, drenched in sweat, but when I rounded the final bend, I saw a group of hikers gathered near the trailhead, chatting and resting. Relief flooded through me. I wasn't alone anymore. I had made it back to safety. I slowed to a walk, still trying to catch my breath, still shaking from the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I glanced behind me one last time, half expecting to see anyone, coming up the trail, but there was nothing. The trail was quiet again, just the wind and the rustling of leaves. No footsteps behind me, nothing. I stopped near the group of hikers, who gave me a curious glance as I leaned against a sign, trying to steady myself. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to explain the panic that had taken over me on that trail. I couldn't even make sense of it myself. One of the hikers asked if I was okay, if I was lost or if something had happened on the trail. I shook my head, still trying to process what I had just experienced. I don't know, I said, my voice trembling slightly. I thought someone was following me. I kept hearing footsteps, but when I looked back, there was no one there. The hiker looked at me like I was crazy, but I didn't care. They probably thought it was just some weird glitch in my head, some trick my mind had played on me after hours of hiking alone. But I knew what I'd heard. I knew what I'd felt. I wasn't imagining it. I didn't stay long. After a few minutes of forced small talk, I made my way back to my car, my mind still racing. I kept telling myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe it was another hiker who had gotten too close, or maybe the trail was echoing in a strange way. But deep down, I knew something was off. I didn't talk about it much after that. I didn't even tell anyone the full story. Felt too strange, too surreal. What could I say? That I'd been followed by footsteps that perfectly mirrored my own? Sounded insane. But I've hiked that trail countless times since, and I always keep an eye on the trail behind me. I'm not sure what happened that day, but I know one thing for sure. I wasn't imagining the footsteps. I don't know what followed me or why it followed me, but there was something there. Something that mimicked my every move, and I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there. I had been looking forward to this day for weeks. The kind of peaceful, simple hike that let me clear my head. Just a quiet stroll through the nearby woods. Nothing too strenuous, just enough to feel the fresh air, hear the birds chirping, and leave the worries of everyday life behind. It was one of those rare days where everything seemed perfect. The weather was mild, the sky was a soft blue, and the trees stood tall, their leaves swaying gently in the breeze. The trail was familiar to me. I had hiked it several times before. It wasn't too long or difficult, just a few miles through dense woods and over a couple of streams. The kind of place that made you feel small but safe, wrapped in the embrace of nature. I started out early in the morning, my boots crunching on the path as I walked at a steady pace. My backpack was light, and my thoughts were drifting. I didn't expect anything unusual to happen. I wasn't expecting anything at all, really. I just wanted a few hours of peace, and that was what I was going to get. Or so I thought. The first sign that something was off came when I realized how quiet it had become. At first, I thought it was just the nature of the forest. But then it hit me. There were no birds, no squirrels darting across the path, no rustling in the underbrush, nothing. The silence was so complete that it almost felt unnatural. I stopped for a moment and listened, my breath catching in my throat. All I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat, thudding in my ears. I shrugged it off. It was probably just a fluke, I told myself. Maybe the animals had all moved deeper into the woods, or maybe it was just the wind, carrying sound away. So, I continued on, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that was starting to settle in my stomach. The trail wound deeper into the woods, and soon, I found myself stepping over roots and rocks, the path becoming more uneven as it led away from the main route. The forest had a way of feeling both inviting and ominous at the same time, with its towering trees and dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy above. But as I walked, I couldn't ignore the growing sense that I was being watched. It was the kind of feeling that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, but I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe a shadow or a patch of dirt that looked odd under the canopy. But as I stepped closer, I saw the unmistakable crimson stain on the leaves beneath my feet. Blood. The trail of it was faint, but it was there, streaking across the ground in small splotches, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. I knelt down, my stomach twisting as I examined it more closely. It wasn't fresh. There was no vibrant red to it. The blood had already started to dry, turning a dark, almost black color. But it was still blood, and that fact alone made my pulse quicken. I knew I should turn back. I knew it didn't make sense to follow the trail, to go deeper into the woods when something like this had clearly happened. But a strange curiosity gripped me. It was as if something was pulling me forward, urging me to keep going. I shook my head and told myself to be rational, to turn around and call it a day. But I didn't. I took one more step, then another, until the blood trail led me off the main path and into the brush. I moved cautiously, stepping over fallen branches and pushing aside thick ferns as I followed the trail. The silence was even heavier now, pressing down on me like a weight. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt, the more the woods seemed to close in around me. The blood trail was still visible, but it was becoming harder to follow, covered by the thick carpet of leaves that covered the forest floor. And then I saw it. Hanging from a low branch, almost camouflaged by the leaves, was a torn jacket. The fabric was stained with blood, dark patches that contrasted sharply against the faded material. It was a small jacket, likely belonging to someone much smaller than me. My breath caught in my throat as I reached out, my fingers brushing the sleeve. It didn't seem like an accident. The way it hung there, abandoned, the blood staining it. Everything about it screamed that something bad had happened here. I stood there for a moment, staring at the jacket, trying to make sense of it. The hairs on my arms were standing up, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. I should have turned back then. I should have listened to that small voice in my head that told me something wasn't right. But I didn't. I called out, my voice shaky, barely more than a whisper. "Hello? Is someone there?" There was no answer, just the wind, swaying the branches above me. I took a few steps back, but the trail of blood continued, winding through the underbrush. It wasn't as clear now, the blood thinner and sparser, but it was still there, leading me deeper into the woods. My legs felt heavy, like they were made of stone, but I couldn't stop moving. Something inside me pushed me forward, told me I had to see this through, and that's when I saw him. At first, I thought he was just another part of the forest, maybe a tree or a rock. But then I realized he was a man, standing just off the trail, barely visible in the distance, his gaunt, pale face staring at me from behind the trees. His clothes were torn, ragged, and blood-stained. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stood there, watching me with an intensity that sent a chill straight through my bones. The blood trail led straight to him. I felt my breath catch in my chest, my heart pounding in my ears. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but somehow I took another step, then another. I called out again, my voice barely more than a croak. "Hey, are you okay?" No response. He just stood there, unmoving, like a statue. My heart was hammering in my chest, and my throat felt tight, as if I couldn't breathe. I took a hesitant step forward, but it wasn't until I turned to leave that I realized something even more unsettling. The blood trail didn't end with him. It continued, wrapping around the base of a nearby tree, disappearing into the thick underbrush. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. There was no way to know how far it went, what it led to, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stay here any longer. Without thinking, I turned and ran. My legs moved faster than they ever had before, my feet pounding the trail as I pushed myself harder, faster, away from that man, away from the blood, away from whatever nightmare had started in those woods. The sound of my breathing was ragged, my chest tight with fear. My eyes darted around, expecting something, anything, to jump out at me, but nothing did. The woods were still, too still. When I finally reached the parking lot, I didn't even look back. I slammed my car door shut and sped off, my hands trembling on the wheel, my mind racing with questions. What had happened back there? Who was that man? What had happened to the person who had left the jacket behind? And why had I followed that trail in the first place? I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even as I drove home, the woods fading into the distance behind me. The next day, I went to the ranger station to ask about what I had seen. I couldn't keep it inside any longer. Maybe someone there could explain it. The ranger behind the counter didn't seem surprised when I asked about the woods. He listened quietly as I told him everything, from the blood trail to the torn jacket, to the man I'd seen standing in the woods. When I finished, he just nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. He didn't say much at first, just stared at me for a long moment. And then, in a low voice, he muttered something that sent a shiver down my spine. "You shouldn't have gone off the trail," he said quietly. "Some things never leave the woods." I didn't know what he meant, but I didn't need to. I knew that whatever was in those woods, whatever had happened there, was something I didn't want to understand. I didn't need to. The last thing I needed to know was that there were things in those woods that were better left undiscovered. I haven't been back to that trail since. I don't think I ever will. I can still see the man's face in my mind, standing there in the distance, watching me. I can still feel the weight of the silence in those woods, the oppressive, suffocating quiet that made every step feel like a mistake. And I'll never forget the blood, never forget how it wrapped around the trees, how it led me deeper, until I was too far in to turn back. Some trails are meant to be left alone. Some things should stay buried in the woods, where they belong. I had been hiking through the Pacific Northwest for hours, the cool, moist air filling my lungs with each breath as I pushed forward on the winding trail. The dense trees stretched out high above me, their dark green canopy providing a soothing shelter from the sporadic sunlight that broke through the clouds. The sound of my boots crunching the damp earth underfoot was the only noise around me, aside from the occasional rustling of leaves as small animals scurried by. Everything felt peaceful, natural, calm. It was what I'd come for, this quiet, this solitude. But then the fog rolled in. It started slowly, like a thick blanket of mist creeping in from the edges of the trail. I'd seen it coming when the air turned noticeably colder and the world around me began to fade into a dull, eerie gray. The trees that had seemed so full of life just moments ago now stood like silent sentinels, their branches barely visible in the thickening haze. The trail markers, which had been easy to spot just a minute ago, began to blend into the surroundings, becoming more and more difficult to find. I paused, reaching for the map in my pocket, trying to make sense of where I was. The fog had a way of disorienting you, stealing your sense of direction. I knew I had another couple of miles to go before reaching the campsite, but in this thick fog, that didn't seem so certain. My sense of time was warped. The minutes felt like hours as I strained my eyes to see anything familiar. It was then that I heard it, a soft, almost delicate voice, calling my name. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The voice sounded so real, so close, like someone was standing just out of sight, hidden by the mist. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me. Maybe a branch had creaked, or a shifting breeze had carried a sound from elsewhere. But no, the voice came again, louder this time, more distinct. It wasn't the wind. It was a human voice, one I recognized in a way that made my skin crawl. "Hey, is someone out there?" I called out, my voice a little shakier than I intended. Silence. Then the voice came again, closer now and unmistakable. It sounded like my name, clear and deliberate, like it was meant for me. It was as if someone were trying to find me, to reach me through the fog, but I couldn't see them. There was no sign of movement, no figures in the mist, nothing. I looked around, trying to spot anything that might explain the voice, but all I could see was the dense fog, thickening with each passing second, swirling like a living thing around me. I couldn't even see the ground in front of my feet properly anymore, let alone any path markers. I called out again, hoping for some kind of response. But again, there was nothing but the thick fog and the oppressive silence. The voice came once more, this time just a few feet away. I could almost feel it in my bones, the way it seemed to brush against the air, like it was right behind me. I spun around, my heart racing. My breath quickened, but I couldn't see a single thing beyond the fog. The trees looked like dark, twisted shadows, their forms hidden beneath the dense mist. I had no idea which direction I was facing now. "Hello!" I shouted, my voice now louder, panicked. Still no response. I could feel the weight of the fog pressing in on me, suffocating me with its cold grip. The voice, which had once sounded so distant, now felt dangerously close, like something was creeping up behind me, just out of sight. I turned in a full circle, my feet unsteady, looking for any sign of a trail or a way out, but the fog seemed to have swallowed everything whole. And then it hit me. The voice wasn't just coming from one direction. It wasn't just behind me or ahead of me. It was coming from all around. I could hear it now, from every angle, whispering my name in that same soft, insistent tone. It was almost like the fog itself was calling me, pulling me in, suffocating me with its quiet insistence. I took a step back, trying to steady myself, but my legs felt weak, like they were made of rubber. My heart thudded in my chest, and my breath came in shallow gasps. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my instincts screamed at me to run. I didn't stop to think. I turned and bolted, not caring which way I was heading, just desperate to escape that voice, to escape whatever was hiding in the mist. I didn't look back. I couldn't afford to. The fog seemed to stretch on forever, and the ground beneath my feet was uneven, slick with moisture. My foot slipped a few times, sending jolts of panic through me as I tried to keep my balance. I had no idea how far I ran. The fog made everything feel unreal, like I was trapped in some kind of strange dream, but my body felt all too real. I was aware of every breath, every heartbeat, as I pushed through the thickening mist, my legs burning, my chest tight. And yet the voice followed. No matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I pushed, the voice was still there, softly calling my name. It felt like it was everywhere, right behind me, whispering, urging me to stop, to listen, to turn around. I felt the icy grip of fear tighten around my chest. Was I being stalked? Had someone been following me the entire time? Was it a person or something else, something inhuman? I couldn't make sense of it. The fog seemed endless, and the voice, just out of reach, never ceased. It became maddening, its relentless call filling my ears, my thoughts, every corner of my mind. I stumbled forward, trying to focus, trying to find something solid, something real. It felt like the world had warped around me, the fog closing in tighter and tighter, suffocating my every sense. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I broke through the mist. The fog was suddenly thinner, the air clearer. I could see the trees again, though they were still shrouded in a light haze. The ground was firmer under my feet, and I felt a brief moment of relief. I stopped, bending over with my hands on my knees, gasping for air. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I had to fight the urge to look behind me. The voice had stopped. For the first time in what felt like hours, there was silence. I stood there for a moment, trembling, listening to the sound of my breath and the quiet rustling of the trees. The world around me looked normal again, unthreatening, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. I stood there a little longer, gathering myself, trying to calm down. The voice had stopped. Had it really been real? Was it a trick of the fog, of my own mind, my exhaustion? I took a few deep breaths and started walking again, slow at first, then picking up my pace as I realized how much time I had lost while running through the fog. The fog was thinning out, and the trail ahead was becoming more visible, though the mist still hung low in the trees, casting an eerie glow over everything. I walked for what felt like another hour, the sound of my footsteps becoming more solid beneath me, more grounding. The trail markers were more distinct now, and the mist had begun to dissipate. My head cleared, the fog in my mind lifting with the fog in the air. I hadn't heard the voice since I had broken free from the mist. I made it to the campsite without further incident, though the unease lingered. The voices, the whispering, still echoed faintly in my head. I set up my tent and tried to push the thoughts from my mind, focusing on the normal tasks of setting camp. But deep down, I knew something had happened out there, something I couldn't explain. The fog, the voice, the silence, all of it felt too surreal to just forget. That night, as I lay in my tent, the sound of the wind in the trees was the only thing I could hear. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the fog had been more than just a weather phenomenon. It had been a warning, or maybe it had been something else entirely. I never hiked that trail again. Even now, years later, I think back on that day and wonder what truly happened in that mist. Whether it was my mind playing tricks on me, or something far darker that I couldn't see, I'll never know. But I do know this. The Pacific Northwest can be as beautiful as it is unnerving, and some things out there, in the quiet and the fog, are better left unexplained. It was a crisp autumn day when I decided to hike a new trail in the Smoky Mountains. I had always been drawn to the quiet, isolated trails that wound through the ancient trees and thick woods, where the chatter of the world seemed to disappear, leaving only the sound of nature. That day, the air was cool but not too cold, and the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I pulled on my boots, grabbed my backpack, and headed out, eager to experience the peace the woods always seemed to offer. The leaves were in full color, turning fiery shades of orange, red, and gold. They crunched underfoot with every step, and the smell of damp earth and fresh wood filled the air. It felt like the perfect kind of day for a hike. Nothing too strenuous, just a peaceful walk in the woods. The trail itself was quiet, the kind of place where it seemed like no one had been for a while. As I walked, I let my mind wander, enjoying the solitude. The sounds of my footsteps and the occasional rustle of wildlife were the only noise. The deeper I went into the woods, the more I felt like I was a part of the landscape, like the trees and the earth were surrounding me, shielding me from the outside world. There was a sense of calm here that I didn't often find in the busy world outside the mountains. But then, I came across something that didn't feel quite right. The trail curved around a bend, and there, in front of me, stood an old tree. It wasn't just any tree. It was a massive, gnarled thing, its bark twisted and dark, like something out of a fairy tale. Its branches were bare, reaching out like skeletal hands, and the trunk was hollow in the center. The hollow wasn't large, just big enough for a person to peek inside. I had heard stories of strange places in these mountains, things that people didn't talk about too openly, like places where time seemed to stretch or where odd occurrences had been known to happen. But it was hard to resist investigating this tree. It was so unusual, so out of place. I stopped for a moment, staring at the hollow. My flashlight, which I had pulled out in anticipation of the coming dusk, flickered as I raised it to look inside. The light danced and trembled, casting eerie shadows on the gnarled bark. For a moment, I just stood there, unsure of what I expected to find. Maybe a small animal had made its home inside, or perhaps there was something hidden within the dark space. The woods were full of mysteries, after all. I leaned in closer, peering into the hollow. At first, all I could see was the blackness of the tree's interior. But then my flashlight caught something, a small, pale mark on the inside of the bark. I blinked, not sure if I was seeing things. It was so faint, but there it was, a tiny handprint pressed into the soft wood. It was impossibly small, much smaller than any adult's hand, and the fingers were delicate, almost childlike. I felt a chill spread through me, something I couldn't explain. It didn't make sense. What child would be out here alone, pressing their hand into the hollow of a tree? And why hadn't I noticed anyone else on the trail? My breath quickened as I took a step back, my heart thumping in my chest. The handprint seemed to be the only thing in the world at that moment. I glanced around, feeling a sense of unease creeping over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I couldn't explain why. The air had grown colder, and the light from my flashlight seemed to flicker more insistently now, as if urging me to move. And then I saw it. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. In the distance, just beyond the tree line, there was a figure standing between the trunks of the trees. A child, their small frame barely visible against the backdrop of the forest. At first, I thought it was another hiker, someone else out on the trail, but something about it felt off. The child didn't move. They didn't even seem to acknowledge my presence. They just stood there, motionless, staring at me from between the trees. I called out, asking if they needed help, but there was no response. No movement, no sound. It was as if the child didn't hear me at all. I took a tentative step forward, the leaves crunching beneath my boots, but the moment I moved, the child vanished into the trees. One moment, they were there, standing still and silent, and the next, they were gone, like they had melted into the forest itself. I stood there for a moment, my pulse racing. I strained my ears, listening for any sound, footsteps, a rustle, anything, but there was nothing, just silence. The woods had fallen completely still, and the only thing I could hear was the pounding of my own heart in my ears. I don't know how long I stood there, trying to process what had just happened. The child's figure had been so real, so clear, but there was no explanation for it. I glanced around once more, hoping to see any sign of them, any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Only the quiet trees and the deepening shadows of the forest. I didn't want to stick around to find out more. My instincts kicked in, and I turned around quickly, my feet carrying me down the trail faster than I had intended. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. A child in the woods? Alone? I had heard rumors of strange occurrences in these mountains, but nothing like this. It was unsettling. I tried to push the thoughts out of my head, telling myself that I had imagined it, that maybe I had just seen a shadow or misinterpreted something. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead. My legs were aching, and my breath was coming in short, fast gasps. As I stepped onto the road, I slowed down, forcing myself to calm my breathing. The world around me was normal again. The evening air had settled into a cool, peaceful quiet, and the last light of the day was fading away. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been off. Something had been wrong in the woods. That night, I lay awake in my tent, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. My mind kept returning to the child in the woods. Who were they? Why had they been there? What did they want? I had heard stories of strange happenings in these mountains, of eerie figures appearing out of nowhere, but I never thought I would experience something like that myself. It all seemed so unreal, yet so vivid. The child's pale face, their stillness, the way they had just vanished into the trees. I couldn't stop replaying it in my mind, each time with a growing sense of dread. The next day, I spoke to some of the other hikers I encountered on the trail. A few of them mentioned having seen similar things, strange figures, a childlike presence near the edge of the forest. One of the older hikers told me that he had heard rumors for years of a child who had disappeared in these woods a long time ago. No one knew exactly what had happened to them, but some hikers swore they had seen the child's figure, standing at the forest's edge, just as I had. Always at dusk, always silent, always watching. I don't know what it all means, but I'm not sure I want to know. The Smoky Mountains are full of mysteries, some of which are better left undisturbed. As for the child I saw, I don't think I'll ever fully understand what happened that day. But I know one thing for sure. I haven't been back to that trail since. Some things are better left unexplored, no matter how beautiful the forest may be. I had just finished a rough week. Work had been stressful. A fight with a friend had been gnawing at me, and I'd felt like I couldn't catch a break. I needed to clear my head. Hiking alone in the mountains had always been a way for me to reset, to find peace in the solitude and the steady rhythm of my footsteps on the trail. I grabbed my backpack, filled it with water and snacks, and made my way out early one morning, hoping to find a sense of calm in the stillness of nature. The trail I was on wasn't heavily trafficked. In fact, I'd only seen a handful of people when I first started, and by the time I'd reached the middle of the hike, I hadn't passed anyone for at least an hour. The further I went, the more I appreciated the silence, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant call of birds. It felt like the world had disappeared, leaving only me and the mountains. As the morning passed into early afternoon, The sun climbed higher in the sky, and I began to notice something strange. A faint noise. At first, I brushed it off, thinking it was just the wind or perhaps an animal moving through the underbrush. But then I heard it again. A soft crunching of leaves, a gentle but consistent footstep behind me. It wasn't the sound of an animal, but the distinct sound of a person walking on the trail. I stopped and glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see someone coming up behind me. There was no one. The trail stretched behind me, empty and quiet. I felt my heart beat a little faster, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I had just imagined it. After all, it was easy to let my mind wander when I was alone in the mountains. I took a deep breath and kept walking, trying to ignore the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. A few minutes later, the sound came again, softer this time but unmistakable. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving with a slight rhythm. I stopped again, listening, but once more, there was no one in sight. I scanned the trail and the trees that lined it, but everything was still. No movement, no sign of another hiker. I tried to convince myself it was just the echo of my own footsteps, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The trail wound its way through the dense forest, and I couldn't shake the sensation that someone, or something, was following me. I tried to focus on the scenery around me, the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves, the smell of pine, the cool breeze against my skin. But the footsteps continued. They were always just behind me, never loud enough to make me feel like I was being directly stalked, but constant enough to make my skin crawl. I pushed on, hoping to outrun the unease, but the more I walked, the more the feeling of being followed seemed to grow. The footsteps would stop when I stopped, and when I moved forward again, they would start up again, as if perfectly in sync with my movements. It was as though someone was matching my pace, walking just far enough behind me that I couldn't see them, but close enough that I could hear them clearly. My heart rate began to pick up, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I knew it was irrational, but the fear gnawed at me. I had to shake it off. The trail began to climb now, leading up to a steep ridge. I figured it would be a good spot to take a break, to get away from whatever was causing me to feel this way. I stopped and set my backpack down on a rock, trying to steady my breathing. I looked around at the rugged landscape, the rocks, the trees, the distant peaks rising against the sky. Everything seemed peaceful, untouched, but the footsteps didn't stop. In fact, they grew louder, closer. I froze, my pulse quickening. The footsteps were right behind me now, closer than they had ever been. I spun around, half expecting to see a hiker, a latecomer, someone just behind me who had finally caught up. But there was no one, just the trees, the mountains, and the same quiet, empty trail. My stomach twisted in knots. I looked up at the ridge above me, where the trail curved and disappeared into the trees. The noise, those footsteps, had come from above. I stood there for a moment, my breath catching in my throat. My mind raced. What could it be? An animal? I couldn't see any signs of movement among the trees. I didn't hear anything but the rustle of leaves in the wind. There was no one, no hiker, no animal, just the unnerving silence of the mountains. The dread was overwhelming now, the feeling that something was very wrong. I didn't wait any longer. I decided to turn back. I had come far enough, and the fear that had been building in me couldn't be ignored any longer. I grabbed my backpack and started down the trail, moving quickly, my steps more hurried than usual. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but the trail was still empty. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, but no matter how often I looked, there was no one there. As I neared the point where the trail split to lead back to the main path, I heard the footsteps once more. This time, they were right behind me, too close. The crunch of leaves was unmistakable, and I could feel the hairs on my neck stand up as the sound grew louder, closer, as though whoever was behind me was nearly on top of me. I whipped around, my breath coming in shallow gasps, but again, nothing. Just the trees, the rocks, the empty trail. Panic surged through me, but I didn't wait to investigate. I bolted, my heart pounding in my chest. My feet slipped slightly on the uneven ground, but I kept running. I had to get back to the main trail, to where there would be people, to safety. The footsteps echoed in my mind, growing louder with each step. Felt like someone was right behind me, closing in on me. I reached the main trail, my legs burning from the effort, but I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. I didn't dare look back. The fear was choking, thick in my throat. I just wanted to get to the parking lot, to the trailhead, to my car, to be away from whatever this was. But even as I neared the end of the trail, that sound, it followed me. One final, loud crunch of leaves. Right behind me, I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath caught in my chest. I spun around, ready to confront whatever was there. But once again, there was nothing. Just the empty, silent woods. No one, no footsteps. I looked around, still frozen in place, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I been imagining it all? Was it just my mind playing tricks on me, fueled by exhaustion and the isolation of the trail? Maybe, but the fear was real, and the sensation that I had been followed was too vivid to dismiss. Slowly, I backed away from the trail, my legs shaky as I moved toward the parking lot. The crunching of leaves stopped. It wasn't until I reached my car and got inside, locking the doors behind me, that I finally let myself breathe. I sat there for a long time, staring out at the quiet trailhead, trying to calm my racing heart. It took a while for my nerves to settle, and even then, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there with me. Something that wasn't quite right. Something that I hadn't seen. The mountains were silent now, and for the first time that day, I felt the weight of that silence. I don't know what happened out there, and I don't think I ever will. Maybe I was just too alone, too lost in my thoughts. Maybe it was an animal, or maybe there was someone else on the trail playing a cruel trick. But what I do know is this: I'll never hike that trail again, and I'll never forget the sound of footsteps following me, even when no one was there. I was hiking the Cascades with my friend Emily, and it was one of those days where the air was thick with moisture and the trees seemed to hum with the quiet sounds of the forest. The kind of day where you feel more connected to nature than ever, with the scent of pine filling your lungs and the constant whisper of leaves underfoot. We had been on the trail for hours, climbing steep ridges and descending into valleys, the rocky paths narrowing until they turned into soft dirt beneath our boots. Our packs were heavy with food and gear, but we were used to it. We took turns leading, and today, it was Emily's turn. We finally reached a small lake by the trail, the water so still that it looked like a perfect mirror, reflecting the jagged peaks of the mountains behind it. The sun had begun to dip below the ridgeline, casting long shadows across the water, and the temperature was dropping. We were both tired, so we decided to take a break and rest by the shore. The sound of birds was fading as night began to creep in, replaced by the occasional splash of a fish or the soft rustle of wind moving through the trees. We sat down on some rocks near the water's edge and unpacked a couple of energy bars, leaning back to stretch out and relax. I watched Emily as she chewed slowly, her eyes scanning the trees across the lake. Then she froze. Her gaze had shifted to something by the water's edge, something that didn't belong. It was a backpack, sitting alone on the grass, just a few feet from the water. The straps were hanging loosely, and it was facing outward, as if someone had just set it down and walked away. My first thought was that maybe someone had gotten careless, left it behind during a break. But then I realized it wasn't just abandoned. It was sitting too perfectly. No other campers had passed us for a while, and no one had been by the lake. "What the hell?" Emily muttered, standing up slowly. I followed her gaze and frowned. The backpack was worn-looking, but it wasn't old enough to be left there like that, not in the middle of nowhere. There were no signs of it being there for a long time. No weathering, no dirt caked into the fabric. Just there. Emily, always the more curious one between us, started walking toward it. I stood up too, feeling a sudden sense of unease creeping up my spine. I didn't know why, but something about that backpack just didn't sit right. It was too out of place, too perfect in its stillness. Emily reached it and bent down to pick it up. She hesitated for a second, as if trying to figure out if it was safe. Then she grabbed the straps and lifted it off the ground, dusting off the wet grass that clung to it. She unzipped the main compartment and, at first, I couldn't see what she was looking at. I just watched her, waiting for her to say something. Her face went pale, and she dropped the backpack back onto the ground as if it had suddenly become too heavy for her to hold. Her eyes were wide, and her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. I stepped forward, my curiosity outweighing my unease, and peered inside the pack. There were muddy clothes, smeared with dirt and damp from the lake's edge. A flashlight, old and battered, lay on top, the batteries nearly dead, its light flickering faintly. But what caught my attention the most was the map. It was folded neatly, with corners frayed from use, but unlike the maps we had been using, this one was old. It didn't show any of the trails we were familiar with. The paths, the markers, everything about it felt wrong. The trails didn't line up with anything on our map, and the markings along the edges, scribbled circles, lines that didn't lead anywhere, seemed out of place. I reached down, but Emily grabbed my wrist before I could touch it. "I don't like this," she whispered, pulling back. "We should leave it here." For a moment, I wanted to argue. Maybe it wasn't that bad. Maybe someone just got lost and left their stuff behind. But then, the thought that struck me was even worse. What if someone had been in trouble? What if they didn't make it out? I didn't want to think about it, so I nodded and helped Emily stand up. We decided to leave it where we found it. Neither of us wanted to carry it or touch it any further. But as we gathered our things, a low unease settled between us. The lake, which had been so peaceful just moments before, now seemed wrong, quiet, still. We headed back onto the trail, moving quickly at first. The path wound around the lake, then up into the trees as we made our way toward the next campsite. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Something was watching us. I kept looking behind me, but every time I did, there was nothing. Just trees, branches, and shadows stretching long in the fading light. But the feeling lingered. The footsteps. I could hear them, faint but constant, as if someone was following us at the same pace. I told myself it was just my imagination. But when Emily glanced back over her shoulder, I saw her face tighten. She didn't say anything, but I could tell she was feeling it too. We kept walking, trying to ignore the sound that echoed through the forest. A steady rhythm of footsteps, too close, too steady, and yet never revealing anyone. The path narrowed as we descended deeper into the trees, and the sun began to dip lower, turning the sky into shades of deep blue and purple. We reached the campsite at dusk, both of us silently relieved to be around other people. The ranger, an older man with a grizzled face and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, greeted us as we set up our tent. "You two doing all right?" he asked, his voice a little too gravelly, like he hadn't had much to say all day. "Yeah," Emily said quickly. "Just a long hike, you know?" The ranger nodded, then glanced around at the other campers who were settling in for the night. "Well, if you see anyone acting strange, or if you hear anything weird, come let me know. We've had a couple of groups go missing in the area recently. No signs, no word, just gone." I froze, my blood running cold. Emily must have felt it too, because she was staring at the ranger wide-eyed. "Missing?" she asked, her voice quiet. The ranger gave a small nod, but his eyes flicked quickly over to the other campers before he leaned in a little closer. "Yeah, their backpacks were found, just like yours was, left on the side of the trail, abandoned, but no trace of them, no signs they made it out." He lowered his voice even more, so only the two of us could hear. "We don't know if it's just bad luck or something else, but something about this place is off. People go missing up here more than you think." I wanted to ask him more, to get more details, but my mouth felt dry, and before I could say anything, the ranger straightened up and gave us a tight smile. "I'd suggest you two get a good night's rest. The weather's gonna change soon, and you don't want to get caught out there if it does." That night, we barely slept. The sound of distant rain tapping on our tent only added to the anxiety building in my chest. The darkness outside felt thick, suffocating, and every time I closed my eyes, I thought I could hear those footsteps again, getting closer and closer. The next morning, we broke camp early, both of us feeling the weight of the previous night's tension. We didn't talk much, and when we packed our bags, I noticed Emily glancing over her shoulder one too many times. Neither of us wanted to be the first to say it, but we both knew we had gotten lucky. Whatever had been following us the day before wasn't done, and the last thing we wanted was to be out there alone again, in that vast, empty wilderness, where something or someone could be waiting just out of sight. As we walked down the trail toward the next section, neither of us looked back. We didn't need to. We both knew that what we had stumbled upon was more than just a lost backpack. Something was out there, and we weren't going to find out what it was. Not if we could help it. We left the Cascades that day, not speaking much until we were miles down the road, but the feeling of being followed never quite left us, and maybe it never would. I had just finished a solo hike up in the Adirondacks. The sun was high in the sky, and the air was warm but not uncomfortable. It had been a long day, but a good one. I'd been trekking through the woods since early morning, pushing myself to the limit. The feeling of being alone in nature, just me and the trail, was something I always relished. The quiet of the woods, the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt, the gentle breeze rustling the leaves. This was my peace. I had planned my route carefully. I knew the trail well, or at least I thought I did. There were a few points where the trail branched off, but I'd studied the map ahead of time, making sure to keep track of my location. I was on track, and everything was going smoothly. But when I reached a trail junction later in the day, I noticed something that didn't sit right with me. I had just come around a bend in the trail when I spotted the trail sign. It was old, the wood faded and weathered by years of exposure to the elements. The letters on it were barely legible, smudged and chipped. At first glance, I thought it might just be a mistake, a marker that had been knocked off course or somehow damaged. But then I looked closer, and my stomach tightened. The sign pointed to a trail I had never seen before. I stopped dead in my tracks. My first instinct was to check the map. Maybe it was just an older trail that had been forgotten or rerouted, something that didn't show up on newer maps. But as I pulled the map from my pack and scanned the area, I couldn't find any mention of it. The trail that the sign was pointing to wasn't on the map. That's when I felt a twinge of unease. It didn't make sense. I had hiked these woods before, and I'd never noticed any trail like this. I stood there for a moment, trying to shake off the feeling of unease creeping up my spine. The sun was still shining, and the woods looked as peaceful as ever. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was overthinking things. After all, it was just a trail, right? I shrugged off the discomfort and decided to keep going. Curiosity got the better of me, and I convinced myself that I would just check it out for a little while. I could always turn around if it didn't feel right. I stepped onto the path, and almost immediately, I felt the atmosphere change. The trail was narrower than the one I had been on. The trees seemed to close in around me, and the ground beneath my feet felt more uneven. The air, though still fresh, felt heavy, like something was pressing down on it. There were no birds singing, no insects buzzing around, just an eerie, almost suffocating silence. I paused for a moment, trying to get a sense of my surroundings. It was unsettling, but I told myself that it was probably nothing more than the isolation of being deep in the woods. As I continued down the trail, it seemed to get darker. The sunlight, which had been filtering through the trees in a warm, dappled pattern, seemed to fade the further I went. The trees were taller here, their trunks thick and ancient, their leaves blocking out much of the light. I couldn't hear any sounds of life, and that unnerving silence only seemed to grow louder. It was like the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something. My heart was beginning to race, but I pressed on. I wasn't sure why, but there was something about this trail, this feeling of being watched, that kept me moving. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but there was an odd tension building inside me, like a premonition of something that I couldn't yet understand. I rounded a bend and froze. On the ground, just a few feet in front of me, was a boot. At first, I thought it might have been mine. Maybe I dropped it earlier without realizing, but then I took a closer look. It was an old leather boot, its surface cracked and faded from years of use. The laces were undone, and it looked like it had been left behind carelessly, as though someone had simply abandoned it in the middle of the trail. I bent down to pick it up, feeling an uncomfortable shiver crawl up my spine. Something about it didn't seem right. The boot was too old, too weathered, and yet it looked like it had been left there recently, like someone had just slipped it off and walked away. I glanced around. There was no sign of anyone, no footprints in the dirt, no other belongings left behind. Just the boot, sitting there like a clue to something I didn't want to understand. I stood up, holding the boot in my hands. I felt a momentary impulse to just leave it where it was, but instead, I tucked it under my arm. Maybe someone had lost it. Maybe I could bring it back to the trailhead and find its owner. It was a small, almost silly thought, but it gave me something to focus on. I continued down the trail, my pace quickening, though I didn't quite know why. The air seemed to grow heavier as I moved forward, and the silence deepened. It was as though the woods themselves were closing in around me, and with every step I took, I could feel the weight of something unseen pressing closer. That's when I heard it, a rustling in the underbrush. It was faint at first, just a slight movement, a soft shift in the leaves. But it was too close, far too close. I spun around, my heart leaping in my chest, but there was nothing. Just the trees, the silent woods, and the deepening shadows. The rustling had stopped as quickly as it had started. I stood still for a moment, my breath shallow and quick, listening for any sign of movement. But the woods were dead silent again. It was as if nothing had ever happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was like the eyes of the forest were upon me, hidden in the shadows, waiting. I could feel my skin prickling, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. But I forced myself to move forward. I had to get out of here. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I couldn't stay. I kept walking, my pace now a brisk jog, my breath coming faster with each step. The trees seemed to loom closer, their branches reaching toward me, and the path grew more overgrown, as if it hadn't been used in years. The sunlight was almost completely gone now, swallowed by the thick canopy above. And then I saw it, a figure, a man standing at the far end of a small clearing. He was motionless, staring straight ahead, his back to me. At first, I thought he might be another hiker, someone else who had ventured down this strange path. But when I called out to him, there was no response. He didn't move. He didn't even acknowledge me. I felt my heart race, pounding in my chest. My legs felt heavy, like they were glued to the ground. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. I turned and ran. I don't know how long I ran, but it felt like an eternity. The woods around me were a blur of motion. Trees, rocks, dirt. Everything passing by in a frantic rush. I couldn't hear anything but the sound of my own breath, the pounding of my feet against the earth. Couldn't look back. I didn't dare. Eventually, I stumbled back onto the main trail, gasping for air, my legs shaking. I stopped for a moment, my hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath. The silence had returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't the same deep, suffocating silence from before. It was just the ordinary quiet of the forest. I stood there for a long time trying to collect myself, the boot still clutched in my hand. And then, as my mind began to clear, I realized something that sent a chill down my spine. The boot wasn't mine to take. It had never been mine. I didn't know why I had picked it up, why I hadn't just left it where it was. But somehow I knew it was wrong. It was a mistake. I didn't know who the boot belonged to or why it had been left there, but I knew it wasn't meant for me. I stood there for a while, looking down at the boot, feeling the weight of it in my hand. It was a strange feeling, like something had shifted, like I had crossed a line that I shouldn't have, but there was no way to undo what had happened. I couldn't explain what I had seen, what I had felt, but I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't be coming back to this part of the woods.